So why has Donald Trump updated his list of tariffs, first of all?
Well, I think, Ros, the initial introduction back in April was a disaster, which saw stock markets plummet, the bond market go into absolute chaos and meltdown, which forced the president to basically give not so much a reprieve, but a 90-day period in which he could negotiate new tariffs. But, you know, it's a very arbitrary kind of measure. I mean, the vague principles that seem to govern this are that any country, such as Australia, that actually runs a trade deficit with America seems to have been hit with a 10% surplus, a 10% tariff. And any country that runs an absolute a surplus with America has been hit with around about 15%. But then you've got, an imposition on Canada, for instance, of 35%, which seems to be based not so much on trade, but more on the idea that Canada now wants to recognise Palestine as a state. So there's all sorts of arbitrary calculations that have come in here.
Australia was threatened with a 20% tariff. We allowed US beef to be imported, or to lift the ban on US beef being imported into Australia. So initially, Donald Trump had a formula for a tariff, didn't he? So there was 10%, 20%, nose back to... Where is that formula now?
Well, clearly the formula has been chucked out the window, but the original formula was deficit in goods divided by total goods imported, divided by 2. I mean, the only things missing here were, multiplied by your birthday and divide by the first number you thought of. But that's clearly been thrown out the window if all these supposedly calculated tariffs have now been changed. When you talk about beef, it's a very interesting situation. I mean, clearly the biodiversity argument, which is something that Australia has stood by for a very long period of time, that was under investigation for years. But if you think about the way trade works, Australia produces huge amounts of beef. We are one of the world's biggest exporters of beef. America is an importer, and that's the way trade works. When you're a country that needs something, you go out and buy it from another country that produces more than they need. Now, we export around 70% of the beef we produce. America doesn't produce enough for itself. That's why they buy our beef. So you can remove those trade restrictions, those biosecurity restrictions. I can't see Australia buying 1 kilo of beef out of America unless it's some specialty.
There has been a slew of trade deals down to the wire ahead of this the new list of tariffs in. That was always Donald Trump's plan, wasn't it, to bring these countries to the negotiating table? And it's worked.
Well, it has. I mean, and I guess, he's threatened very large penalties on them in terms of tariffs and trade imposts, and he's then reduced it so that everybody now thinks that they've got a much better deal than they were originally facing. But if you look at what's happened with Europe just in the past week, now Europe will be hit with a 15% tariff. It was going to be much higher than that. But you've still got France that are extremely angry that the EU actually capitulated to Donald Trump. Germany is saying this is going to be a disaster for their economy. So, the repercussions of this, even though it's not as bad as everybody thought it might be, it's still very bad.
There was a terrible reaction on the markets, as you said, in April when these tariffs were announced. We heard from Sam that the markets are down now. What's going to be the overall global economic impact of this latest round of tariffs?
Difficult to say. I mean, clearly this is going to have an impact on Europe's trade. And the reason for the downturn in the markets today was because US inflation numbers came out overnight, which showed higher inflation than expected, up to 2.6% from 2.4%. Now, the US Federal Reserve, unlike Australia, we have a 2 to 3% target band. America has 2%. So it's now way above where they'd like to see inflation. And the inflationary impacts are flowing through from imported goods. Now, clearly, once you've got these deals all nailed down, the rate of inflation is probably going to continue to rise for some time. You're also going to see a drop-off in global growth as a result of this, and that's what the Europeans are particularly worried about.
Right, and Donald Trump, of course, big fan of tariffs, as he said. He says they'll protect the US, the industry and the US economy. There's been nothing to persuade him otherwise, has there?
Well, it doesn't seem that way. And I mean, there's a very false way of thinking here. As I said, countries trade because they need certain things. you can't just simply put tariffs in place on industries that America no longer has and then expect those industries to move to America. And a good case is Apple. Their phones, they've tried to shift them from China to construction in India because that's where they can actually do it properly. To establish those kind of facilities, those supply chains across America would be extraordinarily difficult and take years.
Ian, thank you.
Thanks, Roz.